Hello and welcome to the Christ Baptist Church devotional, and we are going through the book of Genesis. And we're now almost at the very end. We're in chapter 48. We've got 3 chapters to go, and this is the first of the 3 chapters at the end. And we're now at the very end of Jacob's life, and Jacob and his son Joseph have been reunited. The brothers have been reunited. It seems to be that God's brought about a reconciliation of the family. They've all come together, and now they're living together in the land of Goshen. They're prospering, as we learned in chapter 47, and life is going well. And Jacob's got about 17 years that he's living now in Goshen, but we're now in that 17th year, right in that very end, and we're going to see something that's pretty interesting around worship. And it's Jacob's, you could say it's his final act of worship. Now, we see here in chapter 48, and as we get through it, we don't see the words worship there, but there is something we want to start our chapter 48 off with, and it's what the writer of Hebrews tells us. Here, let me just get to this. We understand the writer of Hebrews gives us a commentary on this chapter 48 here. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 21, by faith Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of his sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. So poor Jacob, he's really at the last year of his life, and as he was dying, he knows his son, he can't see, and he's feeling not well. The Bible tells us in chapter 48, he blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worship. This is an act of worship, leaning on the top of his staff. So let's find out here in chapter 48 what this worship looks like, what Jacob's final act of worship actually looks like. And he lived 147 years total. So this is almost at 150 years. And here he is in his 147th year, and he's worshiping now. Chapter 48, here's the scene. Now it came about after these things that Joseph was told, behold, your father is sick. Father's ill. And here's an interesting note for you. This is the first time the word sick or ill appears in the Bible. First time. But now we're talking about somebody being sick, and they're 147 years old. So Jacob is certainly someone whose body is giving out. He says, your father's sick. So he took his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, with him. Now that's an interesting statement. You hear your father's sick, and first thing you do is you grab your 2 oldest kids. You grab Manasseh and Ephraim. You say, let's go see your grandfather. There's something to that. And I think this wasn't just, hey, let's go see Grandpa. He was bringing them there because he knew it's time to receive a blessing, and he's got his oldest and his second. He needs to get a blessing on them, just like Jacob had a blessing from his father Isaac, although he was not the firstborn. And so he wants to take his children, and this is where the interesting point comes in. He wants to take his children, Manasseh and Ephraim, and to get them a blessing from Jacob, which would really formalize that they are identified with the sheep herders in Goshen and not identified with Pharaoh's household. You see, Joseph has to make a choice. His children are really a mixed lineage. His children are from Joseph, who is of the line of Jacob, but they're also Egyptian from Jacob's wife, or from Joseph's wife. So Joseph's wife is Egyptian, who was related to the high priest there. And now you've got children who are both Egyptian and Jewish, Israelite. And what are they going to identify with? What are they going to choose? Well, Joseph chooses for them. He says, we're going to go and we're going to identify with the abomination or the abominable sheep herders, the people that will not be tolerated in Egyptian society. Joseph chooses the lesser path. He chooses the one that's not going to be with the world, not going to be with the political elite, not going to raised up and going to Egyptian universities. He doesn't care about that. He cares about being with God's people. So he brings his 2 children to go with him to get identified with them in a blessing from his father Jacob. So that's a pretty big step that Joseph made right there to say, I've got trust in God. I believe the promises are greater than what this world offers. So I'm going to stick with that, and I'm going to go with that. Realizing God brought me to Egypt, but it's not where my future is. My future is with my people. So he brings his children. And so verse 2, when it was told to Jacob, behold, your son Joseph has come to you, Israel collected his strength and sat up in bed. So he strengthened himself. He said, okay, now I'm going to do this. So he sits up, and then he begins to talk, and he speaks out to Jacob, or speaks out to Joseph. Then Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. Now, Luz is a city. This is the older name, Luz, but it's really Bethel. And Jacob had come to Bethel twice, in chapter 28 and in chapter 35, where God blessed him. First was running away from Esau, and then was 20 years later when he's trying to come back. And so he remembered, God Almighty appeared to me in the land of Canaan. And he said to me, behold, I'll make you fruitful and numerous, and I'll make you a company of peoples, and I will give this land to your descendants after you for an everlasting possession. So he's saying, it's about the land of Canaan, and I'm giving it to you and your people, and who those people are. And then he sees in verse 5, now your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Ephraim before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. Now this is a phenomenal statement right here. What does this mean? How do we even interpret this language? Is this just saying, oh, I love them, they're mine, they're in my family, here we go? No, there's something much greater here that the Bible tells us. Now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt, so they're half Egyptian, half Israelite. Before I came to you in Egypt, they were born. They're mine. They're as if they came from me. And actually, they're going to take the place of the firstborn, specifically Ephraim and Manasseh, as Reuben and Simeon are. Now, what do you mean he's taking them? What do you mean he's replacing the firstborn? What about Reuben in that? Well, the Bible again is a very good commentary on this. And so in 1 Chronicles chapter 5, what we find here, the writer tells us, now the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, and we have a bracket, a parenthesis here, for he was the firstborn, but because he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel, so that he is not enrolled in the genealogy according to the birthright. Though Judah prevailed over his brothers, and from him came the leader, yet the birthright belonged to Joseph. So what we see here in this act of worship that's happening, what Jacob is doing is he's saying, I'm changing my firstborn to be the two sons of Joseph. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. That's pretty incredible. That's exceeding incredible. He's changing this, and he's changing it to saying, I'm adopting them into my family. He's giving us a picture of adoption here. He's adopting them into actually the specific line of Jacob, not down to the grandparents. And then he says, verse 6, but your offspring that have been born after them, meaning other brothers and sisters of Ephraim and Manasseh, other children of Joseph, your offspring that have been born after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the names of their brothers and their inheritance. So they shall be merged in with Ephraim and Manasseh and have the names of Ephraim and Manasseh. So that it'll be like they are the sons of Ephraim and Manasseh, although they're the brothers and sisters. So the first two that were born in Egypt when Jacob was in Israel, or Jacob was in Canaan, they're the firstborn of Jacob. They're adopted in. Then he said, now as for me, when I came from Paddan, Rachel died to my sorrow in the land of Canaan on the journey, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath, and I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. So he's recalling here, when I came from Paddan, Rachel died, and I couldn't bury her in the family grave there, where I wanted to just have all of them. Abraham, everybody was buried there. And he couldn't do that because she died suddenly. And so his just concern for her, his mourning for her, and I'm sure as he looked in Joseph's face, who looked a lot like Rachel, he looked a lot like her, to be able to remind him of his favorite wife that he worked 7 years for, actually worked 14 years for. And so he's undoubtedly, as Hebrews 11 tells us, he's worshiping, and in doing so, he announces his intention to adopt Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's sons, into his line as his firstborn. That's what he's doing. And he's just shocking Jacob here with this. He says they're going to be mine, just like Reuben and Simeon are. First Chronicles tells us that they take the place of the firstborn. And so then there's somewhat of an adoption ceremony that takes place, an adoption kind of as Jacob fulfills this. Verse 8, when Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, "Who are these?" Who are these? Well, he knows who they are. He can't see very well, but he knows who they are. And this is, in a sense, this is a lot like a marriage ceremony when the pastor, the father is bringing the bride down, and the pastor says, "Who gives this woman to this man?" Who does this? And in essence, he's asking Joseph, "Who are these? Who is this?" And so Joseph said to his father, "They are my sons whom God has given me here." So he said, "Bring them to me, please, that I may bless them." That's why Joseph brought them to Jacob, so that they would be blessed. But now first he hears that they're going to be adopted in as firstborn, which is incredible. Now the eyes of Joseph were so dim from age that he could not see. Then Joseph brought them close to him, and he kissed them and embraced them. Just like Isaac's eyes were too dim to see when Jacob went and tried to deceive. Remember, Jacob tried to deceive Isaac. He took his brother's birthright, even though his brother sold the birthright. He took it. Well, now Jacob's eyes are too dim to see, but he's talking to Joseph. He knows who's who. And Joseph brought them close to him, and he kissed them and embraced them. So it's really Joseph, and it's really Manasseh and Ephraim, and they're all there. And Israel said to Joseph, "I never expected to see your face, and behold, God has let me see your children as well." So it's a way more than expected blessing for Jacob to see this. At the end of the adoption ceremony, Joseph took them from his knees, and he bowed with his face to the ground. So it's like, "Who are these?" Take them, and he bows to them, and he's saying, "I'm accepting you in." So there's an interesting little ceremony going on there from verses 8 to 12, where it's really saying, "I'm taking you in now as mine." So there's adoption that Jacob has while he worshiped. He received Jacob's sons leaning on his staff, Hebrews tells us, and he worshiped. And in that worship, he's giving us a picture of adopting in these sons of the promise. Well, this gets into the really surprising ceremony of the blessing. And Jacob's worship is involving giving a blessing and actually blessing these two. But does it in such a way that exhibits just how God's grace really works. Verse 13, Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand toward Israel's left, and Manasseh with his left hand toward Israel's right, and brought them close to him. So he puts Manasseh on Israel's right hand and puts Ephraim on Israel's left hand. And both boys are standing right here next to their grandfather so that Jacob could take his right hand and bless Manasseh and take his left hand and bless Ephraim. The right hand is a source of power, is a source of the firstborn. No doubt, as Manasseh was firstborn, that Joseph raised him what it is to be a firstborn. Here's how a firstborn acts. You got to take care of your brother. You got to really protect. You got to do all these things as a firstborn, because with it comes this great blessing. So he stages it so that Manasseh's on his right hand, so that Manasseh's left hand is on Israel's right, so he can grab him like that. But Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, crossing his hands, though Manasseh was the firstborn. So what he did was, Jacob said here, he goes, oh, Manasseh's on his right, Ephraim's on his left. He goes, okay, all set. So he takes his right hand and puts it on the head of Ephraim, he takes his left hand and puts it on the head of Manasseh to bless them. He crosses his hands, so he puts his right hand, the hand of power, but not on the right hand side, over here on the left hand side. He does that. And then he blessed Joseph and said, "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who's been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who's redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads. And may my name live on in them, and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." So he gives them this profound blessing of God's blessing on each of his children. He says, "The God has been my shepherd all my life, and the angel who's redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads, and may my name live on in them." See, this is him saying Jacob lives on in him, not the name of Joseph's wife, who is from the priesthood of Egypt, not the name of an Egyptian, none of that. May my name live on in them, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. He's committing him to be of God's people. And it's interesting, we see this play out, because when we get to Exodus chapter 1, you see a king arose, a Pharaoh arose in Egypt, and they didn't know anything about Joseph. Nobody's ever heard of Joseph. Nobody knows anything about Joseph. Why? Because his children were not raised to be Egyptians. They were not raised to be in Egyptian ways. They were raised as shepherds, as God's people when they were in Egypt. They were raised to be separate people of God, not Egyptians. So you forget who Joseph was. That was somebody 100 years ago. And remember, they were in Egypt for 400 years. So after so many generations, who's Joseph? I don't know, some guy. Why? Because no offspring went to become Egyptians. That's why. And this blessing is what secured that they maintained their identity of being separate. In a way, this blessing is like Jacob just really securing for them that they would be separate, know who they are, and their identity in Jacob, not in Egypt. Well, that's really similar to us, isn't it? How God has adopted us into the family of God, sent his Holy Spirit as a seal to us, so that we would be separate, so that we would be not identified with the world, but identified with the people of God, identified to be with Christ. And that's how we live our life. But we're living our life in Goshen. We're living our life in kind of the Egypt of the world. We're living our life not amongst God's people. We're living our life here, but our identity is not with that. Our identity is with God and God's people, because he's set his seal on us and given us the blessing of the Holy Spirit to do that. Well, we see that picture right here. Jacob giving a blessing to adopted sons. He adopted them to be his firstborn. Like his firstborn, they adopted them in. He gives us that picture. He receives them in. And then he gives them this blessing, that they'll grow into a multitude, and they'll carry on the names of Jacob's fathers. Well, verse 17 tells us here, this blessing. When Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on Ephraim's head, it displeased him. He was not happy. Now, he's not going to fight his father. It's an honor amongst his older father. But it displeased him. And he grasped his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. I mean, I've trained up Manasseh all these years to be the firstborn. I mean, Dad, you can't do this. We've got to get Manasseh to be the oldest, the firstborn, the prominent, because I've trained him for that. It's what his position is. Joseph said to his father, "Not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Place your right hand on his head. Take your hand off of Ephraim, put it on Manasseh's head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He will also become a people, and he also will be great. However, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations." He blessed them that day, saying, "By you Israel will pronounce blessing, saying, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh." Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. Jacob is doing something very strange here. He's choosing to not have the firstborn, who's legitimately there. He's the right person. He's trusts his son Joseph. You know, is this Jacob just trying to say, I got away with it, I'm gonna do it again? Is he deceiving his son Joseph? No. Remember Hebrews 11, he is worshiping. He's worshiping God, and he's understanding God's grace, and he's learned after 147 years, quit doing your own thing and start to think, act, and speak what God tells you. You walk the way God tells you. You speak the words God's telling you. He's pronouncing a blessing here, he's ill, he's coming in, and you know what? He's speaking what God is putting into his mind, telling him, this is what I want to have happen. God's grace is not predictable. He doesn't always work through the firstborn. He doesn't always work through what we would expect in terms of prominence. We see that Adam and Eve had a son, their firstborn, Cain, but he was not the prominent one. It was given to Abel's sacrifice was offered and accepted, but even Abel didn't make it. It was the later son Seth. David was not the firstborn. We see it throughout, even Jacob, even though he illegitimately took it, that was God's plan. And so Jacob is speaking the words of God here in this blessing. And it's affecting Joseph a bit because it's not according to Joseph's plan. But he said, don't worry, Manasseh the older will become they'll become a people. They'll become a separate people, they'll have a whole separate people. Now Ephraim will become a multitude of nations. They're going to become greater. They're going to become more of them. But may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. They both get it. And this gets to be where we got to be careful. Just because somebody gets more, somebody gets something different, our human nature tells us to either be jealous or upset because God didn't bless me like he should have. Those kinds of things. God has a plan for everybody. God has a plan for everything to be put in its place, and everything is joy seeing how God works it out. And here's how grace, which is very unpredictable, works out in this blessing. Jacob crosses his hands because God's plan is for Ephraim to be greater than Manasseh, and that's okay. They've all got their roles to play. But they will be blessed because they're identified with Jacob, not identified with the land of Egypt. So in Jacob's worship, what he's doing is he's adopting Joseph's kids in, and then he's having them identify with him, and so there's a family identity, not a worldly identity. And lastly, what we see is there's somewhat of a gift and a prophecy of God's hope, God's fulfillment, verses 21 and 22. Then Israel said to Joseph, behold, I'm about to die, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. I'll give you one portion more than your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow. Now what's going on here? Well, after this blessing, Israel says to Joseph, now it's ill, I'm about to die, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. And he will bring you back to the land of your fathers. We're not here in Egypt for long. I don't know how many lifetimes it's going to be, but it's not going to be for long because you will go back to that land that God promised us. See, again, the word of hope. And specifically, he gave to Joseph. Now, let me help you something. There's a Hebrew word here that's going to be helpful. He says, I give you one portion more than your brothers. Actually, that word portion is the word Shechem. Shechem. That's an interesting word. It's Genesis 33:19. It's where Joseph bought the land from a man named Hamor, which is Shechem. And the word actually means a mountain slope. So he says, I will give you a mountain slope more than your brothers. I will give you Shechem. You who are above your brothers. I'll give you Shechem. I'm giving that to you. That's where the family plot is, the family grave. And how do we know it's Shechem? Well, Joshua 24:32. Let me just read that to you. Joshua 24:32 tells us, now they buried the bones of Joseph, which the sons of Israel brought up from Egypt, at Shechem, in the piece of ground which Jacob had bought for the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money, and they became the inheritance of Joseph's sons. So I'm giving you Shechem, and that began the inheritance of Ephraim and Manasseh. And it's also the place where Jacob had his two sons. They killed all the people of Shechem because they raped their sister. So they came and they did this, and he said, whom I drove out with my sword and my bow. So Jacob acquired Shechem, and this is all now hope in his worship, saying out of the history that was not a very good history, obviously, with the killing all those people and being in Shechem, but he did purchase this land out of hope. This is my land, is what God's given to us. I want you to have this land, Joseph. And ultimately Joseph saw fit that his bones would be buried in Shechem, in the same place where his ancestors were buried. So he gives them hope. So in worship, what does Jacob do here with his last days of his life? 147 years old. He immediately gives us a picture of adoption, adopting in Joseph's sons. He gives a blessing to Joseph's sons that says, this is your identity in me. Not with the world, not with those outside, in me. And here's the hope that comes. You're going back to your land. That's what Jacob does in worship. So we learned something about worship. When you're 147 years old, it's not the way we do it in church today, for sure, but it's a worship indeed, we would say, where he's giving us God's grace and God's identity right there for us in Genesis chapter 48, as Jacob now is having his last conversation with his son Joseph. Well, that's it for Genesis chapter 48, and I hope you join us as we get to Genesis 49 next.